I'm about to start making some ceramic wall pieces that are going to look something like this. I've made quite a few of these over the last few months and they've been quite popular. People have liked them and I've run out, so I'm going to make some more. It's an ideal time of year to do this. We're sort of well into winter here and these need to dry out slowly. So the sort of climate that we've got at the moment means that they're going to dry out slowly. They need to dry slowly to retain this flatness. It's a flat slab of clay and I want them to be absolutely flat, not bow at all or warp at all. And if they dry out slowly, I'm more likely to achieve that. So making something that's a very different sort of object is quite enjoyable and quite a nice creative challenge and a sort of slight change of direction for a while. When I'm making pots like this, I want to break up the sort of form by adding pieces into the form, cutting bits out and adding pieces in. And in this one I like the way that the marks that are on the surface sort of interrupt the outline of the form, and I want to achieve that with these pieces as well. So this little piece up here, I've added that piece in, and then what I've done here is sort of cut a piece off and then join it back on, but deliberately join it back on so there's a little bit of a step in the outline of the form. So I really like the sort of irregular outline of these pieces, and I like the way that they're then contained within a very sort of clean, white, quite precise frame. I did these collages actually. Just very quickly and quite playfully, and I quite like, these also have these sort of irregular edges which I quite liked, almost sort of accidentally formed by whatever bits of paper I was using, but I liked some of these as sort of starting point. I've redrawn this one here and that's going to be the basis of one of the pieces I'm going to make, and this was another one that I liked, and I've redrawn it here, just thinking about how it might actually work as a wall piece. So I've got a few, these are not designs that I'm going to follow really closely, but it's a sort of starting point, and as I start making them, they'll start going off in their own direction. And that wide approximately. So that's they're roughly rectangular, but of course they will have bits cut out of them and steps put into them, but that's the sort of basic proportion of them. And I quite enjoy being able just to sketch out with a pencil where some of the shapes might go and some of the marks might go, and just how I might cut some of the pieces out and thinking about slotting them back in. So although these pieces remain quite two-dimensional, they also have quite a sort of three-dimensional surface to them, because I'm having slight steps and raising pieces up and having sort of overlaps of shapes within the surface. They become a sort of hybrid 2D 3D sort of object. So I've added a little bit of terracotta slip, and I'm just going to put some of this white engobe over the top of it. Most of the marks I'm going to make are going to be made after I've actually cut the shape, but I'm going to roll some grog into the surface to create a bit of texture. So I'm just going to use some of this molokite along with a bit of, this is some of the engobe that I use that dries out, and I ground it up, and that creates quite a nice texture. Both of those are quite white, and then I've also got a little bit of the similar thing to the white engobe, bit of pink engobe, just to add a little bit of colour. and then I can just embed those textures into the surface of the clay. And when this piece is sort of more finished, it might be that some of that texture will only be barely evident, but it will be there, and it's an important part of the initial sort of texturing, the initial surface, and it just means that it's not all going to be flat. Edges are always important if it's a vessel form or whatever, but on a wall piece I think they're even more important because they're sort of very prominent. So when I'm cutting these out, I certainly don't want them to be too sharp. If I cut with a knife like that, I'm going to end up with a very, very sharp edge, which I don't want. So what I'm going to do is sort of score, and I deliberately want a little bit of a wavy line. This shape is going to go here eventually, but I'm just going to go through that at the moment. In fact, I'm going to cut out pretty much a rectangular shape, with the exception of a little step just for this bit here. So it's just going to go in there and then down like that. I deliberately want that to be a bit wavy. I don't want to get a ruler and do that. I want it to look soft. And what I was going to say is all I'm doing is scoring, not cutting through, because the edge will be a nicer edge if I break the clay like that rather than cut it all the way through. So I've just scored so I can sort of control where the clay is going to break, and then I can remove the edge like that. And these pieces that I'm taking off, the edges, could be quite useful later on for some of the shapes that I might cut out and add on. So I want a piece to go on there, so probably one of these edges will become that. But that edge, I quite like the look of that. I'm going to soften it a little bit more just by doing that with my finger. But I like the sort of irregular look of that already. That's good. Okay. For these initial layers of colour, I'm using slips and engobes. And this is a slip made of a black body that I've just sort of turned into a slip by watering it down, and I want that as a sort of darker base. So because that's the first bit of colour that I've put on there, that's almost going to be, it's almost going to disappear in the final piece, but it'll be evident, it'll be there in the background. And then I like putting on these engobes and slips when they're in different consistencies. So this is very wet, a very wet engobe that I'm going to put on, and I like the way that it runs. So this is something that's quite easy to do when I'm making a vessel form, but on a wall piece I can just sort of put it on a board, prop it up, and then if I add a little bit of water, just controlling the amount of water that I'm putting on. But I like those. I like those runs. I like the runs, but I like the way it becomes very sort of washed out, where it gets very watery. Doing that makes it very wet, and this is now going to have to dry for a while before I carry on with it. But I want to retain that sort of look of wet clay, so I don't want to mess around with that at all, really. I just want to let that dry as it is, and then I can work on top of it, and some of these drip marks will still show through. So this has been left overnight, and it's dried out, or well, the surface has just dried out enough for me to carry on working on it. So I'm going to add this shape somewhere on this side. Might be this piece of clay, it might be another one similar. I'm going to cut out a section here and then fit it back in, and I'm going to put some marks, more prominent marks down the bottom here as well. But because this is dried a little bit, I can now brush on a little bit more ongo to build up the surface depth. So I've got underneath this white there is a sort of pale blue colour, and I want to put this white on in such a way that the blue will still show through in places. And these drips have dried nicely as well that I put on yesterday, and I don't want to lose those, but I do want to just tone it down a little bit, so it's just going to get a very sort of light layer of white across those. Okay, I think we'll speed this up a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to let that dry now for a bit. Sometimes it's difficult to decide straight away whether a piece is actually finished, so I'm going to put this to one side and let the surface just dry off a little bit, and then I'll make some decisions about whether I want to work into that anymore, but I think that's mostly done. So I've got 2 more pieces that are on the go, and I'll get those started and then have a look at them all, and then maybe work back into this one a bit more. This is a little bit of mark making that I really like. It sort of reminds me of collaging, but with ceramic materials. So I've made these little tiles that are fired, and I can embed these into the clay. They've got little numbers, so I've impressed these little number stamps into them, and I'm just going to arrange them on here. I want some of them to, in fact, I'm just going to hit this one with a rolling pin because I want it to break. So I'll use a couple of pieces in there. So I think I'll have them about there, and then just use a rolling pin and just enough pressure just to embed them into the clay. Now, a lot of people would tell me that that will not work, but it's worked for me before, so I'm trying it again. Rules are for breaking. And then I'm going to have those marks there, but I want to put some kind of drawn marks over the top, so I just want it to be quite sort of spontaneous without thinking about it too much. And those I'll just tidy them up, and then I'm going to put a layer of slip over that as well. But I like these. And I made that mark up there as well, which I really liked. That big sort of circular shape that goes off the edge of the tile. And this is the other one in progress. All coming on. So I finished making these. There's 3 of them, and they're just drying out slowly in order to keep them flat. And there's more work to do, not in terms of the construction, but there will be colour to add once they've been fired. And I've got an idea about where I might put some bits of coloured glaze, but I'll look at them when they're fired and make final decisions. There's some little stenciled marks here that I quite like along the top edge of that one. And here's that number that I was adding, that I've just sort of painted over because I didn't want it to be too prominent. So I've just put a bit of white on go over the top of that. And here are the little tiles that were impressed into the clay, which I've also painted over, but they'll still be quite visible once the piece has been fired. This is the texture that I put on in the demo, and I've painted over it, but I didn't want to paint over it too much because I do quite like that texture. It's quite a nice contrast to the rest of it, which is a bit smoother. When the pieces are made and drying out like this, the colours are not very vibrant, but when they're fired they will be much brighter. And this is what they look like when they're brighter, because these are finished. And these have had extra bits of glaze and underglaze added, which makes there's more contrast in the colour and brighter sort of focal points. That's how I make wall pieces. Thank you for watching. If anybody's interested in buying one of these pieces, please message me. I can ship them anywhere in the world, particularly these smaller pieces. I often ship these across the world. So please just email me or message me, and I can explain how that can be done, and I can show you what pieces I've actually got in stock.